There are moments in life when you don't know exactly what's wrong, but you know something weighs heavily within you. It's not a lack of faith. It's not a lack of effort. It's not a lack of ability. It's that silent weariness that appears when you've done everything right, when you've been faithful, when you've persevered, and still the results don't come. The mind begins to get confused, the heart gets tired, and the soul silently asks, why, if I'm doing the right thing, does everything seem to be going in the opposite direction? Perhaps today you are not living a visible tragedy, but you carry an internal battle. You keep moving forward. You keep fulfilling your responsibilities. You keep smiling outwardly. But inside there is a feeling of exhaustion, of prolonged waiting, of promises that seem to take longer than you imagined. And it is precisely at this point that many people begin to doubt themselves, to question their worth, or even to think that God has forgotten them. The Bible never hid these seasons. On the contrary, it showed them with profound honesty. There are stories that were not written to motivate quickly, but to accompany long processes. And one of the most intense human and spiritual stories in all of Scripture is the story of Job. Not because he was weak, but because he was strong. Not because he failed, but because he resisted. Job represents all those people who did the right thing, feared God, walked with integrity, and yet went through pain. This is not a video for those looking for quick answers. It is a message for those willing to understand that there are processes that cannot be explained in a single day. Job teaches us that faith is not only shown when everything is going well, but when everything seems to be falling apart and you still choose not to let go of your trust. His story does not begin with loss, it begins with faithfulness. And that is important to understand from the beginning. Job was not off track when the pain came. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. If today you feel confused, emotionally exhausted, or with the feeling that you are doing everything right and not seeing results, stay. This is not a message of guilt, it is a message of understanding. Throughout this video, we will explore 7 profound lessons that arise from Job's life. Lessons that not only explain pain, but offer direction, clarity, and hope for those who choose not to give up, even when they don't understand the process. Before talking about Job's losses, it's important to understand who he was before the pain. Job was not an ordinary man from a spiritual point of view. The Bible describes him as an upright, righteous man who feared God and shunned evil. He lived with balance, responsibility, and reverence. He was not perfect, but he was consistent. His life was not built on appearances, but on principles. Job did the right thing even when no one was watching, and that silent integrity is what makes his story so powerful. Job was also prosperous. He had family, stability, recognition, and security. But his prosperity was not his identity. He understood that everything he possessed came from God, and that is why he lived with gratitude and humility. This detail is essential, because many times we believe that suffering only comes to those who err, when in reality, the story of Job makes it clear that even those who walk correctly go through difficult seasons. In a short period of time, Job lost almost everything. His possessions were destroyed. His family structure broke, and his body was afflicted by a painful illness. The most shocking thing was not just the material loss, but the speed with which everything changed. The stability that had taken years to build crumbled without warning. And this is how many crises come into our lives. They don't give time for preparation, they just happen. Despite everything, Job did not understand the reason for his suffering. There was no clear explanation, no evident mistake, no logical cause. And this is one of the greatest conflicts of the human being, to accept a pain that has no immediate explanation. Job did not have access to the full vision of the process. He only saw loss, silence, and waiting. But what Job did not know was that his story was being used to reveal an eternal truth, that authentic faith does not depend on favorable circumstances. Job's story was not written to explain the why of suffering, but to teach how to go through it without losing one's essence. Job was not destroyed by pain because his identity was not in what he had, but in who he was before God. His life confronts us with a profound question. If everything external disappeared, what would remain within us? Understanding Job's context helps us to understand that pain is not always a consequence of a mistake, and that God's silence does not mean absence. Sometimes the process is greater than the explanation, and it is from this foundation that we begin to extract the teachings that transcend time and speak directly to those who today also live moments of loss, confusion, and waiting. One of the biggest mistakes many people make is believing that true faith eliminates pain, as if trusting in God meant not suffering, not crying, not getting tired. Job's story completely shatters that idea. Job was a man of faith, and yet he experienced deep, real, and continuous pain. His faith did not isolate him from suffering, it sustained him within it. And that is a fundamental difference we need to understand. Job cried, Job lamented. Job expressed his anguish with harsh and sincere words. There were days when his soul was so tired that he wished he had never been born. And yet in the midst of it all, his faith remained alive. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he chose not to let go of God, even when he didn't understand. Job's faith was not silent or comfortable. It was a faith that went through the dark night of the soul. The Bible never teaches us to pretend strength when we are broken inside. On the contrary, it shows us that God draws near to the brokenhearted. Job teaches us that feeling pain does not make you less spiritual. Crying is not a sign of weakness. Being tired does not mean you have lost faith. Sometimes it is quite the opposite. You keep believing even when it hurts. The problem is that many people, when they feel pain, begin to question their own faith. They think something is wrong with them, that they are not believing enough, that they have failed spiritually. But Job demonstrates that mature faith is not the absence of suffering, but perseverance in the midst of it. True faith is not tested when everything is going well, but when everything seems to fall apart and you still choose to keep trusting. There are pains that cannot be explained quickly. There are processes that are not resolved in a short prayer. And that does not mean that God is far away. It means that the process is deep. Job did not lose his faith because he felt pain. His faith deepened because he chose to remain even wounded. He understood, even without words, that God does not demand emotional perfection, but honesty of heart. If today you are going through a pain that you cannot explain, if you feel emotionally tired or mentally confused, remember this: feeling pain does not nullify your faith. Your faith is not measured by your smile, but by your decision not to give up. God does not abandon those who suffer. He walks with those who resist. And that truth, when understood, completely changes the way we go through difficult moments. When something is lost, humans automatically tend to look for culprits. And often the first culprit is ourselves. What did I do wrong? Where did I fail? Why did God allow this? Job's story directly confronts that logic. Job lost a lot, but not because he had failed. His loss was not punishment. It was a process. And this truth is one of the hardest to accept when pain comes without explanation. We live in a culture that associates blessing with good behavior and loss with error. But the Bible does not work in such a simplistic way. Job was blameless, upright, and feared God, and yet he went through a season of profound losses. His story teaches us that not every closed door is a consequence of sin, and not every fall is a sign of spiritual failure. Sometimes losing is part of a path we do not yet understand. The problem with believing that all loss is punishment is that this idea generates unnecessary guilt. The person begins to punish themselves internally, to doubt their worth, to carry a weight that does not belong to them. Job also faced this conflict when the people around him tried to explain his pain with accusations disguised as advice. They insisted that something must be wrong in his life, but they were wrong. Job's suffering was not rooted in error, but in a greater purpose. Losing something does not mean that God is withdrawing his favor. Often, what leaves reveals what truly sustained your life. Job discovered that his relationship with God did not depend on his prosperity, but on his identity. When everything external disappeared, what remained was his faith, his character, and his integrity. And that was what kept him standing. There are losses that hurt deeply because they were linked to legitimate expectations, dreams, and plans. God does not minimize that pain, but Job's story invites us to look beyond the immediate moment. Sometimes what is lost was not punishment, but preparation. It was not destruction, but separation from what could not accompany you to the next level. If today you are experiencing a loss that you do not understand, do not rush to blame yourself. Do not assume that God is angry with you. There are processes that are not explained in the present, but are revealed over time. Job teaches us that losing does not mean that everything is over. Sometimes it is precisely the beginning of a deeper, silent, and necessary transformation. One of the most difficult experiences in spiritual life is not visible pain, but silence. There are moments when we pray, ask for direction, cry out for answers, and we hear nothing. There are no clear signs, no immediate relief, no explanation. The silence of God can be more distressing than the loss itself. And Job knew that silence in a profound and prolonged way. For much of his process, Job received no direct answers. There was no immediate explanation for why he was suffering. God did not appear to clarify every doubt or justify every loss. Job spoke, questioned, expressed his anguish, but heaven seemed silent. And that silence was an essential part of his formation. Because God's silence does not always mean absence. Often it means depth. Humans tend to associate silence with abandonment. When there is no answer, we think something is wrong, that we are not being heard, that God has moved away. But Job's story shows us a different truth. God can be deeply present, even when he seems silent. There are processes that are not accompanied by words, but by inner transformation. In those moments, God works more on who we are than on what we understand. Silence forces the soul to mature. When there are no easy answers, we learn to trust without depending on explanations. Job did not understand what he was going through, but he decided not to break his relationship with God for lack of answers. He remained, and remaining when there is no clarity is one of the highest forms of faith. Many people abandon their spiritual path not for lack of faith, but for emotional exhaustion in the face of silence. They await a sign, a confirmation, a word that never arrives at the expected time. Job teaches us that silence is not rejection. It is a space where God strengthens the root. What is sustained only by quick answers does not withstand long processes. If today you feel that God is silent, do not assume that he has turned his back on you. Perhaps he is working in a deeper way than you imagine. There are things that God does not explain because he first needs to transform you from within. Silence does not mean you are alone. It means the process is serious, intimate, and formative. And when the purpose is revealed, the silence makes sense. There is a widespread idea that a person of faith does not question, does not doubt, and does not express dissatisfaction, as if true faith were absolute silence and emotionless acceptance. The story of Job completely disproves that belief. Job questioned, spoke, complained, and expressed his confusion with strong words. And yet God did not reject him, because questioning is not losing faith. It is taking faith to a deeper, more honest level. Job did not pretend to understand what he was experiencing. He did not hide his pain behind religious phrases or try to feign a strength he did not feel. He spoke from the place where he was wounded, and that is something God honors. Mature faith is not that which never asks, but that which dares to dialogue with God, even amidst confusion. Job teaches us that God does not seek perfect words, but sincere hearts. The problem arises when people confuse questioning with rebelling. Job did not rebel against God, he addressed him. There is a big difference between walking away and speaking out. Job chose to speak, even when he received no answers. His questions were not born of unbelief, but of a deep need for understanding. And God allowed that process because he knew that the relationship was strengthening, not weakening. Many people feel guilty for not understanding what they are going through. They think that doubting is a sign of spiritual weakness. But Job shows us that sincere questions do not offend God. On the contrary, they reveal a real relationship. God is not fragile in the face of our doubts. He does not turn away because we don't understand. He draws near when we decide not to silence what we feel. Questioning is also part of spiritual growth. When everything is going well, faith is usually simple. But when pain comes, faith deepens. Job went from knowing God by tradition to knowing Him by experience. And that change did not happen in prosperity, but in questioning. Questions born of pain open space for a more solid, more conscious, and more mature faith. If today you have questions that you don't know how to express, don't punish yourself for them. Talking to God from confusion does not distance you from Him. It keeps you in relationship. Faith is not broken because you ask questions. It breaks when you decide not to speak anymore. Job teaches us that even amidst doubt, it is possible to remain. And remaining, even without understanding, is one of the deepest forms of faith. There are processes in life whose goal is not to destroy you, but to shape you. And that is one of the deepest lessons the story of Job leaves us. Many times we think that the greatest miracle is the final restoration, but before external restitution, God works an internal transformation. Job did not leave the process the same man he entered. He emerged more conscious, more profound, and more steadfast in his identity. Resistance is not passivity. To resist does not mean to remain immobile, waiting for everything to pass. To resist is to continue with integrity even when everything seems unfair. Job resisted when he lost what he loved, when he was misunderstood by those beside him, and when the silence prolonged more than expected. He did not resist because he was strong by himself, but because he decided not to abandon his essence. And that is character. Character is not formed on easy days. It is revealed and strengthened on days when no one sees, no one applauds, and no one understands. Job was stripped of everything that could support his external image, and in that process, what truly defined him became visible. Adversity removed the superficial and exposed the essential. And the essential was his relationship with God. Many people want the final result without going through the formative process. They want restoration without resistance, the answer without waiting, clarity without depth. But Job teaches us that there are things that can only be learned by enduring. Resistance teaches patience, waiting teaches humility, and adversity teaches dependence. None of that is learned quickly. To resist also means accepting that not everything is resolved when we want it to be. Job did not control the time of the process. He did not negotiate terms or conditions with God. He learned to live one day at a time, sustaining himself in the confidence that his story was not over. And that inner posture was key to his faith not breaking. If today you are resisting, do not minimize what you are experiencing. Resisting is tiring, exhausting, and sometimes hurts more than the initial loss. But every day you persevere without abandoning your values, something inside you strengthens. The character that God forms in the process is what will allow you to sustain what comes next. Job teaches us that before lifting up, God establishes. Before restoring, God strengthens. And before showing the end, God works deeply in those who decide not to give up. After a long period of loss, silence, and resistance, the story of Job leads us to a truth that many people hope for, but few truly understand. Restoration is not immediate, nor is it superficial. God does not restore to return exactly what was lost. He restores to deliver something deeper, firmer, and more complete. Job did not receive a simple compensation for what he suffered. He received a transformation that prepared him for a new stage of his life. Restoration came after perseverance. Not while Job struggled for answers, not when he demanded explanations, but when his heart was strengthened to receive what was to come. This teaches us that restoration depends not only on desire, but on inner preparation. Many times we ask God to return what we have lost, but we don't realize that first we need to be ready to sustain the new. Job was restored because he no longer depended on external things to feel complete. The seventh and last great lesson from Job is that the ending God writes is always greater than the beginning we imagine. Job began his story with possessions, family, and stability, but ended with a deeper understanding of God, a more mature faith, and a life rebuilt on solid foundations. The ending was not just abundance, it was fullness. God not only multiplied what Job had lost, but gave him a new perspective on life and purpose. Many people believe that after a great loss, the best they can hope for is to return to the starting point. But the story of Job shows that God does not work in circles, he works in advancement. What seems like a setback is often preparation for something greater. God's ending is not a repetition of the past. It is a more conscious, firmer version, more aligned with his purpose. Job teaches us that suffering does not have the last word. Pain does not define the end of the story. Loss does not cancel purpose. When God restores, he does so completely, not just by returning, but by strengthening. Therefore, even if you don't see results today, even if you feel that everything is stalled, remember this: the process is not over. The chapter you are living is not the end. If you have resisted, if you have persevered, if you have not let go of your faith, even without understanding, you are closer to restoration than you imagine. The end God prepares is not always what you dreamed of, but it always surpasses what you lost. And when that end arrives, the entire process makes sense. If you've made it this far, it wasn't by chance. No one stays with a message like this for so long unless something inside is looking for answers. The story of Job was not just written to be read. It was written to accompany people going through long, silent, and difficult processes. People who haven't lost faith but are tired. People who still believe but need direction for the next step. Understanding the story is important, but there are times when understanding is not enough. There are seasons in life when the heart needs more than information. It needs accompaniment, daily clarity, and a voice that reminds day after day that God is still present even when there are no visible signs. Job did not go through his process in a single day. It was step by step, decision after decision, resistance after resistance. That's why I want to speak to you honestly. If this video touched your heart, it's probably because you are currently living a moment where you need practical, spiritual direction, not just inspiration. You need to organize your mind, strengthen your spirit, and walk with clarity again, even if the process is not yet over. With that in mind, I created the ebook 7 Days of Direction with God. This ebook is not just a text to read once. It's a 7-day spiritual accompaniment designed to help you reconnect with God, organize your thoughts, calm your heart, and make decisions with more peace and purpose. Each day was designed to guide you step by step, like a spiritual walk, when you don't know exactly where to go next, but you know you don't want to give up. Purchasing this ebook is a decision of commitment to yourself and your process. It is not a magic solution, it is a guide. It is not an empty promise, it is direction. If today you feel that you need to walk with more clarity, with more faith, and with less confusion, this material was created for you. The link to purchase 7 Days of Direction with God is in the pinned comment. Don't walk this process alone. God doesn't demand that you understand everything, but he does honor those who decide to move forward, even with a weary heart. Just as Job was not stuck in pain, you will not remain there forever either. There is direction, there is purpose, and there is a new chapter being written. And sometimes the first step forward is to accept the help that God has already placed before you.